So you want to own a tire factory. Buy some rubber, some steel wire, a few giant molds, stamp out circles of black rubber all day, and sell them to every car, truck, and plane on the planet. That's the picture in your head, and on paper it looks like one of the safest businesses imaginable. Because unlike a gym membership or a plane ticket, a tire is not optional. Every vehicle on Earth eventually wears through its tires and needs new ones, whether the economy is booming or collapsing. Here's the problem. The thing that makes tires the most reliably needed product in the automotive world is exactly what makes owning a tire factory one of the most brutally capital-intensive, chemically complex, and thin-margin businesses you could possibly buy into. A tire factory is not really a rubber business. It is a commodity chemical business wearing the disguise of an auto parts company, and the moment you understand that difference, everything about how a tire factory makes money, and quietly bleeds money, starts to make sense. Let's start with the price list, because just like every asset we've broken down before, tire manufacturing comes in tiers, and the tier you buy into is really a different business entirely. At the bottom sits the small regional retread and specialty tire plant, producing a narrow range of tires for agricultural equipment or industrial forklifts, the kind of facility you can build or acquire for somewhere between $10 and $30 million. Above that sits the mid-size passenger and light truck tire plant, the kind that supplies regional markets and smaller automakers, requiring anywhere from $200 million to $500 million to build from scratch, depending on capacity and automation level. At the very top sits the mega facility, the kind operated by the handful of global giants that dominate this industry. A single greenfield plant capable of producing tens of millions of tires a year, and these can cost anywhere from $1 to $2 billion to construct, before you've cured a single tire inside it. And then there's a separate category entirely, the aircraft and off-the-road mining tire specialists, producing tires that can cost $50,000 apiece for the giant mining trucks that haul ore out of open-pit mines, a tiny production volume compared to passenger tires, but an enormous margin per unit, because there are only a handful of factories on Earth capable of making a tire that large at all. Each of these is really a different bet on the same underlying question. Do you make your money from an enormous volume of cheap, interchangeable tires, or a small number of highly specialized ones that almost nobody else can produce? Now here's where the naive mental model falls apart immediately. You assume the expensive part is the factory building itself, the conveyor belts, the curing presses. It isn't. Not entirely. The genuinely expensive and volatile part is what goes into the tire before it ever touches a mold, the raw materials. A modern passenger tire is a chemical engineering project disguised as a rubber ring, built from natural rubber tapped from trees in Southeast Asia, synthetic rubber derived from petroleum, carbon black, steel belting, and a proprietary chemical recipe of dozens of other compounds that each manufacturer guards like a state secret. Natural rubber prices alone can swing by 30 to 50% within a single year depending on weather conditions in rubber-growing regions of Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam, since a drought or a disease outbreak on plantations halfway across the world can instantly compress your margins on every tire rolling off the line months later. Synthetic rubber and carbon black are both derived from crude oil, which means every time oil prices spike, your primary input costs spike right alongside them, and unlike a software company, you cannot simply absorb that cost increase by writing better code. You are permanently and structurally exposed to two of the most volatile commodity markets on the planet at the same time, and raw materials alone can account for 50 to 60% of a tire's total production cost, an enormous share compared to almost any other manufactured good you could name. Then there's the machinery itself, and this is where the capital intensity of this business becomes genuinely staggering. A single tire curing press, the machine that takes a raw, uncured tire and bakes it under enormous heat and pressure into its final form, costs anywhere from $500,000 to over $1 million per unit, and a mid-size plant needs dozens of them running around the clock. Add tire-building machines, extruders, mixing mills for the raw rubber compound, quality control and X-ray testing equipment, to check every tire for internal defects before it ships. And even a modest facility requires hundreds of millions of dollars in specialized machinery that has essentially no resale value outside the tire industry itself. This is a business where your equipment is either making tires 24 hours a day or actively losing you money, because unlike a gym where an idle treadmill costs you almost nothing, an idle curing press represents hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting completely dormant while your fixed costs, your lease payments, your utility bills, your skilled labor keep accumulating regardless. Location matters here in a way that's almost the mirror image of a gym or a boutique studio. You are not chasing foot traffic within a 10-minute radius. You are chasing proximity to two very different things simultaneously: cheap and reliable access to raw rubber supply chains, which pulls plants toward Southeast Asia and increasingly toward manufacturing hubs in China and India, and proximity to the automakers and distribution networks that actually consume your finished product, which pulls plants toward the American South, Eastern Europe, and Mexico, where major automotive assembly plants cluster. Get this balance wrong, and you're either paying enormous shipping costs on heavy, bulky raw materials or enormous shipping costs on heavy, bulky finished tires. And tires are astonishingly expensive to transport relative to their sale price, precisely because they are mostly air and rubber, taking up enormous cargo space for their weight. So where does the actual revenue come from? And this is where the industry splits into two completely different businesses under one roof. The first is the original equipment channel, selling tires directly to automakers to be mounted on brand new cars rolling off the assembly line. This sounds glamorous, having your brand name on every new vehicle from a major manufacturer, but it is, counterintuitively, the least profitable part of the entire business. Automakers negotiate these contracts with brutal leverage, squeezing tire manufacturers down to razor-thin margins, sometimes barely above the cost of production, because the tire company is competing against several rivals for the exact same contract, and the automaker knows it. The real money lives in the second channel, the replacement market, selling tires directly to consumers and independent shops when their original set wears out. Replacement tires carry dramatically higher margins than original equipment tires, sometimes 2 to 3 times higher, because the buyer in that transaction isn't a giant automaker with negotiating leverage. It's an individual driver standing in a shop who needs new tires today and is comparing brand reputation and warranty terms rather than squeezing a manufacturer on unit cost. This is exactly why the smartest players in this industry treat original equipment contracts almost like a loss-leading advertisement, accepting thin or even negative margins on new car tires purely because it plants their brand name on millions of vehicles, virtually guaranteeing that a meaningful share of those drivers will buy the same brand again at full replacement market price a few years later. Now for the part of this business almost nobody outside the industry understands: the shadow economy hiding inside every single tire that gets thrown away. It's called end-of-life tire disposal, and in most developed countries it isn't optional. It's a legally mandated cost, baked directly into the price of every new tire sold. Manufacturers and retailers are required to fund the collection, shredding, and recycling of old tires, which get converted into things like rubberized asphalt for roads, playground surfacing, and tire-derived fuel burned in cement kilns as a substitute for coal. This isn't charity. It's a genuine secondary revenue stream for companies that own the recycling infrastructure, since a shredded tire has real commercial value to a cement plant looking for cheap fuel. But it's also a regulatory compliance cost that smaller manufacturers without in-house recycling capability have to pay third parties to handle, quietly eating into margins that were already thin to begin with. The case studies in this industry tend to fall into two categories worth understanding before anyone signs a check. The first is the catastrophic recall, and the most infamous example remains a major American tire brand's crisis in the early 2000s, when a wave of tread separation failures linked to hundreds of deaths and injuries, concentrated heavily on a popular SUV model, resulted in the recall of over 6 million tires, a settlement and legal bill running into the billions of dollars, and permanent reputational damage that took the company over a decade to partially repair. It remains the case study every tire manufacturer's quality control department cites internally, because in this industry, a single manufacturing defect in curing temperature or rubber compound ratio, multiplied across millions of identical units already sold and mounted on vehicles worldwide, can turn an efficient factory into a generational liability overnight. The second category is the successful global consolidation play, the handful of giants, headquartered in Japan, France, and the United States, that now control the majority of global tire production between them, having grown not through explosive innovation, but through decades of steady acquisition of smaller regional manufacturers. Patient capital investment in ever larger and more automated plants, and relentless cost discipline in a business where the product itself is fundamentally a commodity that consumers struggle to tell apart without a brand name stamped on the sidewall. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question: how much money do you make if you do this right? In the realistic mid-size scenario, a single passenger tire plant producing around 10 million tires a year, built for roughly $300 million, generates several $100 million in annual revenue, but after raw material costs eating 50 to 60% of that, energy and labor consuming another meaningful share, and equipment depreciation on all that specialized machinery, the plant typically nets a profit margin somewhere in the mid-single digits to low double digits, translating into tens of millions of dollars in annual profit in a good year, a respectable but unglamorous return given the enormous capital tied up in the ground. In the realistic bad year scenario, natural rubber prices spike 30% due to weather disruption in Southeast Asia. At the exact same moment, oil prices climb and squeeze. Synthetic rubber costs too, while a soft year in new car sales reduces original equipment orders, and that same plant can see its margin compressed to almost nothing, turning a comfortable double-digit million-dollar profit into a near break-even year, despite selling the exact same number of tires as the year before. So if you do decide to buy a tire factory, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you succeed. It was never really about how many tires you can produce. It's about how well you can survive the months when rubber trees on the other side of the planet decide not to cooperate with your spreadsheet.